Welcome to the Raising Our Vibration podcast, where we explore higher consciousness through spiritual practice. And today, Stephen and I are very excited to have on our guest, Dr. Dawson Church. So welcome, Dawson. I'll give a brief intro and then we'll get right into questions because we have a lot of questions lined up that we want to ask you, Dawson.
I'm so grateful and happy to be here, Kevin. It's good to join you and Stephen.
Thank you. Such a pleasure. So let's begin with some background. I know most people probably know all this, but for those who don't, Dr. Dawson Church, PhD, is a prolific, award-winning author of many books on health, psychology, and spirituality, including The Genie in Your Genes, Mind to Matter, and Bliss Brain. He's the CEO of Energy Psychology Press, a professional trainer in the Emotional Freedom Technique, or EFT, and founder-director of the National Institute for Integrative Healthcare, dedicated to research into consciousness and energy as primary healthcare modalities. So Stephen and I were just really thrilled to have you on, Dawson. And I first came to know your work back in 2007 with this nugget of a book, The Genie in Your Genes. And at that time, I was just beginning to publish Qigong and subtle energy meditation courses online. And when I read this book, and I don't know if you can see, but I've dog-eared probably 50 pages are dog-eared. And the whole thing just has underlines and stars. So I was really happy to have some science that I could use to support the practices that I was teaching, because I knew them experientially, right? I knew how that felt, but in terms of conveying it to others, I was like, here's some wonderful science, some research that just supports everything we're doing. And especially the chapters, the body piezoelectric, the connective semiconducting crystal, and energy psychology. The research in those chapters really supported what I was doing with Qigong and subtle energy meditation. And that's kind of where I'd like to start here with our questions. Stephen and I teach subtle energy meditation. We've written a book about that, Raising Our Vibration, which is a guide to subtle energy meditation. And we teach a course and have an app of subtle energy meditation. So if we could start with that subject, what is your take on what subtle energy is, and if we're able to measure it?
Yeah, well, if you look at the history of science, you find that we observe effects in the real world, and then we develop explanations and theories for how they come to occur later. And it's a sequence well worth bearing in mind, because, for example, we knew that aspirin worked for about 100 years before we figured out how it worked, and we used willow bark for thousands of years before that. Penicillin, it was discovered that penicillin suppressed bacteria, but we didn't know how for another 34 years. So there's a lot of lag often. I mean, things like electromagnetism. The first book on electromagnetism and healing was written in 1700, but it wasn't until a long time later that we actually were able to formulate ideas, really precise ideas, about how these forces worked. And so Arthur Clarke, who wrote the book 2001: A Space Odyssey, said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And so to those early people using compasses and these mysterious stones that could point north, or people who were the early researchers in any of these fields, they observed these effects, but we didn't know what the fields were. We couldn't see them, we couldn't observe them. And then gradually we figure out what they are. Like now there's this amazing research now on geomagnetic fields, the fields of the planet, the fields of the solar system, and how these are interacting with life forms, including human beings. And so we observe effects. And for example, one of those effects is healing. You put your hands around someone's body or around their head, in healing touch or touch for health, and then people heal. Distant healing, and a really interesting phenomenon where people are working on others at a distance. And so we see plenty of evidence for distant healing. So we didn't know what was going on for a long time until we began to be able to read electromagnetic fields and then get more of an idea what was happening in terms of physical interactions going on there. And distant healing, we still don't have very good explanations for why this happens. There are a few in my book, Mind to Matter, and they're really intriguing, they're really suggestive, but they aren't definitive yet. And so that's just what we call subtle energy, is energy where we haven't discovered the mechanisms of action of how this works yet. And if you look at the history of research, you find eventually we do. And it's just very mysterious initially when you see that compass needle turning and it always turns north and you have no idea why. Later on, we figure it out, and there's that lag, and that lag we call these things mysterious phenomena or magic, or all the skeptics say, oh, they don't exist. So
Right, exactly. Yeah, it doesn't exist at all. I do that. That's why we really emphasize in our meditation courses the felt sense, and really getting people into that felt embodied sense, right? Because then somebody doesn't need to explain it to their mind when it's self-evident in their own body, right? In their own experience. Yeah.
Absolutely. The experience is all. Yeah.
So how do you view the relationship between what we call subtle energy and consciousness itself? Does that
Well,
make sense?
consciousness is really foundational. And when I was writing Mind to Matter, I looked at the research on how the four forces of physics are all subject to other forces. And that research is just absolutely amazing. Like, just for example, one of the four forces is electromagnetism. And in one of the studies I describe in the book, there was a famous healer called Bill Bankston, who's a dear friend of mine. And he has this ability, and his students, he teaches the ability to heal cancer. It's just particularly good with healing cancer, both human and animal cancers. And so there have been many randomized controlled trials of Bill's ability to heal cancer. And in the one study, the researchers who were studying Bill's abilities were using rats with mammary cancer, and they had two groups of rats: a control group in a green room in one part of university campus, and a experimental group in the second room, the red room, in another building on the campus. And at random times, a pager sounded on Bill's waist, and at those just random moments, he was asked to send healing energy to the rats in the red room only, and not to the ones in the green room. So he would do that for about 20 minutes. They also had little devices below each cage of rats that measured the electromagnetic field in the room. And what was later found was, first of all, the rats that Bill was working on healed, and the rats in the green room did not heal. The rats in the red room did heal. And at the very moments when at random Bill was sending healing intention to those rats, only the rats in the red room, at the very moment, those random intervals, the electromagnetic signature of that room changed by up to 22%, and it was unchanged in the other room. So here you are. Here's a phenomenon where human consciousness, healing intention, is literally producing shifts in one of the four fundamental forces of physics. And there are studies showing that the other three are the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, and gravity. And there's research showing that human intention affects the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, gravity. The rate of radioactive decay is so stable that we base cesium clocks in science to tell the time on the phenomenon of radioactive decay. And those cesium clocks are accurate to 1 second in 3 million years. These are highly accurate clocks because this rate of radioactive decay is a known factor, except when a Qigong master puts his hands on a block of a radioactive substance and you tell him, speed up that rate of radioactive decay. And there are many replicated experiments showing that certain Qigong masters literally can either speed up or slow down that rate at will. So human consciousness is able to shift those four forces that are fundamental to physics. And so what I argue in the book Mind to Matter is that consciousness is the force that underlies them all. It's consciousness that is the foundational force of the universe, and that as consciousness shifts, other things around you can shift. The book is not called Mind Over Matter, it's Mind to Matter. And the whole argument in the book is we want to align our minds with the great universal consciousness, become one with non-local mind, and then be a conduit of the creativity, the joy, the compassion, the benevolence, the gratitude, all of these characteristics of non-local mind into local mind. And a local mind aligned with non-local mind is then able to partake of that consciousness of the universe, and then usually see all kinds of things shift in the outside material reality. So consciousness is really fundamental. Consciousness is one. There isn't one consciousness here and another consciousness over there. It is something. And the big variable is the degree to which we partake in that consciousness. Some people, it's tragic. There are people who are born, live their entire lives, 50, 100 years, however long they live, and die, and never pay any attention to connecting with that universal consciousness. Other people awaken. And when they awaken, they're simply becoming aware that they are in this field of consciousness, part of this field of consciousness, indivisible from that field of consciousness. And when they realize that, they realize they're one with everything. Because when you're one with that, you're one with everything else. So there's no somebody else and you. And I'll just wrap this up by saying that I just had today, actually, I've had a little bit of a problem with somebody who is working on one of my projects. And so it's been a problem that's been going on for about a year. And just in the last while, I've said to myself, basically all kinds of things in my professional world are going swimmingly, but there's this one guy in this one project that's not. And so this week I've just been saying to myself, so I've been focused on trying to get this guy to straighten out and shape up and keep his commitments. And just this week I said to myself, imagine if I treated this simply as a problem in my own consciousness. Imagine if I simply hold this guy in unconditional love.
Brilliant.
Regardless of how many times he screws up.
Mhm.
And so I've just been doing that for the last couple of days. And then this morning, we had a breakthrough, and this guy finally did what he has been supposed to be doing in his work. So it's really interesting that we shift our own consciousness, and then everything starts to change around us. So that's the way to work there, is to simply be one with that consciousness every single day, download all of that into your local mind and local activities, and treat that as though that is reality, which in fact it is.
Beautiful. That's a great example.
It really is. I'm Dawson, I just love the fact that you mentioned Bill Benston, because we interviewed Bill a couple of episodes ago, and Bill referred, in fact, to intention much in the same way as you have, and particularly to one of the very first healers that he studied, and how he could try everything scientific with that healer, and the healer couldn't tell him exactly how he did it, but it happened. He would do he'd do distance healing. He would do healing. He would do cards and could choose them, but he couldn't tell Bill how he actually did that. And of course, Bill, working with his different imagery techniques and so on, where he cycles patterns and so on to kind of drop you out of local mind and into universal mind, what was really part of what he discovered, that the simple intention, then almost dropping any sense of technique, allows you to connect with just what you're speaking about, universal consciousness and the non-local mind and so on. So I'm particularly curious about that universal consciousness, because obviously you've had a deep and long-lasting both research and your own experiential techniques and methods over time. What's worked most successfully? I know you're an expert in EFT and all those surrounding methodologies. So in your own personal experience with spiritual practice, what really helped you to connect to universal consciousness and to non-local mind?
Yeah, so for me, I think as for many people, it's a process of getting out of the way. And our minds are so distractible, and mine is about as distractible as anyone else's. It's so funny. I'm thinking that I've been meditating so many years, and my ability to still my mind is still very limited. And there are people who can still their minds. My wife is actually quite good at doing it. And so I'm living with somebody who is, and who does that in meditation, and I still struggle with that. So that's the one challenge that people have. And so in 2008, 2009, I was at several scientific conferences speaking there, along with people like Joe Dispenza and Roland McCready from HeartMath, and people from the biofeedback and neurofeedback world. And I just learned all of these wonderful techniques that they all teach. And then one day I began to experiment with applying them all together. And I thought, what happens if you stack them? What happens if you did some EFT tapping, and then you did some self-hypnosis, and then you did some exercises from mindfulness, then you did heart coherent breathing, and you just did all these things together. So I strung them all together, and suddenly I was in a deep meditative state. And so the body, and moving the body to that state, is for most people much easier than moving the mind to that state. And a lot of non-dualist teachings are really mental, and they're trying to talk yourself into non-dualism or an experience of a non-dual state. And that works for some people, but if you can get them into a felt sense, as you used the word earlier, that's wonderful term from Eugene Gendlin in the 1970s. If you can get them into a felt sense of their connection, then they have this orientation point. Like one man who used, so I developed this method called eco meditation, and it simply, again, stacks all these things on top of each other in a 5-minute routine. So you breathe, you do heart coherent breathing, you do another method that puts you to deep coherence. There's a neurofeedback method that stimulates the vagus nerve and raises parasympathetic function and suppresses sympathetic function. You do some tapping to release stress. You add all these things together, and suddenly you just, boom, you just drop into this very, very deep state. And so I've been having people do this, and because it's body-based and does not require stilling your mind, and does not require any kind of philosophy or mental perspective, it's super easy for people. And funny thing is that I invented this technique, put it up free on the web like more than 10 years ago, and I recently tried to get it trademarked. And I thought, I've had this thing for many years now. I may as well apply for the trademark on it. And so I applied for the trademark, and I was denied the trademark. The trademark office said, no, you can't have a trademark because it's generic. We've done searches, and there are hundreds of websites now that are using eco meditation. And I was just so happy to get that trademark denial, because it's like so many people have used this, and they say things like, I could meditate at loss. This is the first time when I tried this, I could meditate, and it's body-based. So I'm a real believer in body-based interventions. It's just easier for most people to do a little bit of tapping, do a little bit of heart coherent breathing, relax their tongue, relax certain muscles. That's easy. Trying to reach mental or spiritual states is usually much more demanding, and it's possible, but it's harder.
Beautiful. You're really speaking to the choir here on
Absolutely.
that. It's exactly what Stephen and I have found in our teaching, is really getting people to move and tap and ground and feel the body, and really generate that felt sense as an entry point into meditation. Just that by using these interoceptive cues, sequence of interoceptive cues, and that just naturally the mind gets absorbed in that and starts to feel something, and the thinking part of the mind just starts to quiet down. Just not because you're trying to quiet the mind or still the mind, but because the mind gets absorbed in this felt sense, and this sense of relaxation and energy and vitality and love and feeling the heart and so on. And then the mind just kind of quiets or goes into the background because this is in the foreground.
What you got to do is you got to get the ratio of the engagement of the default mode network and the task positive network just right. And normally, if we're engaged in a task, doing something, whatever it might be, tying our shoelaces or doing a spreadsheet, composing an email, talking to a friend, any task is going to engage a bunch of lateral regions of the brain called the task positive network. And the moment you stop doing a task, the minute you finish and take a breath and take a pause, that part of the brain shuts down. We're not making that demand of it anymore. And what lights up is the part of the brain that the brain defaults to when it's not doing something, and that's the default mode network. So it just pops into the default mode network whenever we aren't doing a task, and it keeps on shifting its resources based on how we're using it. And it's a really amazing thing. I mean, our muscles, when we're already using them, they're needing a lot of energy, a lot of glucose, a lot of blood, a lot of nutrients. And so you use your muscles a lot. They consume a lot of energy. The brain is consuming 20% of your body's energy, whether you're awake, whether you're asleep, whether you're thinking hard, whether you're relaxing, whether you're laying on a hammock, reading a novel. It's just at 20%. And I was really puzzled by this. And it's like the analogy I use in one of my books is a car's engine. And whether the car is doing 100 kilometers an hour down the superhighway or whether it's sitting parked, it's still just revving at the same number of RPMs all the time. And this makes no sense from a biological standpoint, apparently. But what is happening is that any spare cycles available are being grabbed and activating the default mode network. And that's not on these lateral brain regions. That's a central region that starts over here and runs through to the back of your occipital cortex. So you have this part of the brain that is highly active when you aren't doing a task. And so when you try and meditate and you close your eyes, now, first of all, your optic nerve is conducting about 9 million pieces of information per second to your occipital part of your brain. So you close your eyes, all that flow of information is cut off. Now the brain's whirring around trying to figure out what to do with all these cycles without any information in them. And so for most people, the mind starts to wander. So you cut off that information. You aren't doing a task anymore, and the default mode network goes crazy. People who are traumatized, people who have major depressive disorder, meditation is terrifying for them. Sometimes they close their eyes, and their minds are then just filled with all of the bad things that either happened in the past or might happen in the future. So the trick is to keep the task positive network a little bit engaged, so that the default mode network does not pop on. And something like you just described, that interoceptive awareness, can do that. So like in my guided meditations, I've given people information about what to do. I'll say things like, relax your tongue on the floor of your mouth and slow your breathing, keep your breathing slow at 6 seconds per in-breath, 6 seconds per out-breath. And I'll say this over and over and over again. And each time they do that, they focus on that. That's a little bit of a task they have to do. Keeps the task positive network over here a little bit lit up, suppresses the default mode network, and then they can drop down. And so meditations that give you, like Yoga Nidra, same thing. It gives you a little bit of stuff to do. Mindful body scanning does the same thing, gives the task positive network a little bit of things, something to do. And if you do that, you can quiet the default mode network. And of course, the default mode network is the seat of suffering. People who are depressed have a highly active default mode network. People who are traumatized have PTSD, who are already anxious, their default mode network is highly active. And how to shut that thing down is really the major challenge of the meditator. And Tibetan monks and Franciscan nuns and others who had a lifetime of practice, you tell them to focus on compassion, inner peace, and their default mode network just goes bam, just shuts off like that. They have a lot of practice doing that. For most of us, it is still active. It's a source of mind wandering. It's a source of misery. It's a source of repetitive negative thinking. It's a source of suffering. And so we're now working out, again, this is science at the leading edge, figuring out, oh, that's why that interoceptive body awareness of the felt sense, that's what it's doing. That's why that's working, because of the mechanics of the brain, why just a purely mental approach is going to be less effective. So that's what the cool thing about science is we're figuring out how all these things work now.
Dawson, this is probably a beautiful opportunity, just as Kevin was going to say, that to ask you about the relationship between the default mode network, the seed of suffering, and what you've termed the Enlightenment Network, because I think, especially for many of our listeners, they would love to hear both how they are related and also how to access that Enlightenment Network.
Yeah, so Mind to Matter has Genie in Your Genes has been very successful. Genie in Your Genes as a book, it's sold over 100,000 copies over the last 10, 15 years. It's been really influential. It hasn't aged very much. It's gone through 3 editions. And then Mind to Matter was my next big book in 2018, was really did well too. It sold over 100,000 copies in many different languages. And it's been just a real influential book in the human potential movement. And then my publisher, Reed Tracy from Hay House, I brought him the proposal for Bliss Brain. And he said, Dawson, this is a book on bliss, and happiness books we found don't sell very well. But I wasn't convinced that people would love the idea of getting into Bliss Brain. And I was totally wrong. So the book has sold about 20,000 copies. It's not bad, but it hasn't sold 1/5 as much as Mind to Matter or Genie in Your Genes. And so the argument I'm making there, the central argument of the book in chapter 4, 5, and 6 is neurotransmitters. If you have a lot of dopamine in your brain, dopamine has the same reward system activation as cocaine and heroin. Psilocybin and serotonin have the same molecular structure. So microdosing or macrodosing with psilocybin is using your serotonin receptors in your brain to produce pleasure. So my whole argument in that book was, you activate all these pleasure neurochemicals in your brain, you're going to feel super good. And when we look at these Tibetan monks, I mean, they're just way off on ecstasy. They're in levels of happiness that most people have no idea even exist. So I talk about the Enlightenment Network in that book, but now I'm writing a new book where really just brilliant neuroscientists, Richard Davidson at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, and Andrew Newberg. Andrew Newberg wrote a book called How Enlightenment Changed Richard Davidson's 4 circuits in the brain. Really convinced people. Didn't land. Didn't result in the kind of change I was hoping for. So now in my new book, I'm making the hardware argument, and the hardware argument is, you have this in your brain. You have the Enlightenment Network. Everyone does, and so there are 4 circuits that are part of the network. And what I recommend in Bliss Brain is we develop them in a certain order. And they're very simple. We know what they look like from neuroscience studies. We know what the brain that regulates emotion. You have to learn to regulate emotion because we have lots of emotions. Somebody says something annoying to you, you're worried about a problem at work, and then that distracts you. You can't get into elevated states. So you have to learn to regulate those emotions. And again, these Franciscan nuns have superb emotion regulation. I mean, they just dial it down. They just like flicking off a light switch. Negative emotions do not arise and distract them. The second circuit you need to develop is the concentration circuit. These Tibetan monks, they have absolute concentration. And of course, the famous story of the Buddha, that under the Bodhi tree, after 6 years of effort, he just gave up, sat down there, and for a whole night had perfect concentration. So I don't have perfect concentration. Few of us do. We do have a concentration network, and we know what it looks like in the brain. So we want to learn to activate that as well. We also want to activate the self-obsession regulation network. That's where we regulate the default mode network. So regulating emotion in the emotional midbrain, the limbic system, regulating the default mode network, which is the obsession with self, I, me, mine, the me show, I call it in Bliss Brain. You just lose interest in the me show. And the fourth of the circuits is the compassion circuit. And compassion is kind of a term, I think, that neuroscience grabbed from Tibetan Buddhism. And it's not actually what we're finding is really going on. It is actually a bundle of positive emotions. It's a mixture of gratitude, awe, joy, altruism, compassion, extreme happiness, all of these things together in one, what we're calling a positive meta emotion. So that's what the insula does. And so you light up 1, 2, 3, these 4 circuits of the Enlightenment Network. And again, everybody has those. You just have to turn them on. So my newest writing, my new book, which will come out in a year or so, is all about the hardware. And it's saying, sure, you have caveman brain, you have the default mode network, you have all these stress circuits, you have fight and flight. Your body's got that down, and you're spending a lot of your life there. You also have this hardware that can bring you to ecstasy. So just switch this Enlightenment Network of those 4 circuits on, and then giving people instructions on how to do that, how to activate each of the 4 circuits, experience what they feel like, and then together they're able to grasp that feeling of the Enlightenment Network. They also, oddly enough, begin to feel it in their heads. So I've had people come up to me now at workshops several times in the last few years and say, Dawson, I've been doing your meditations for the last few months. I'm feeling a lot of pressure over here. And they point to the temporal parietal junction, one of the key aspects of the Enlightenment Network. Or they say I'm feeling a ton of pressure right between my eyebrows. That's the default mode network shutting down, and it's producing rapid neural remodeling as these networks become really good at working together and then start to really hardwire. So we're seeing functional connectivity changes in the brain in a month. So that's sort of the new direction I'm taking things in, hoping to convince the next 100,000 people, perhaps the next 100 million people.
Hopefully.
You got that stuff in your head, use it.
Yes,
Brilliant.
beautiful. And I think so many people, when they meditate and they start having these sensations, and they might think something's wrong, right? They might think, oh, what's happening in my brain? Or they might have some fear around that. So really being able to provide some of the scientific background and here's what's happening in your brain, I think can help to calm people's fears and just let them allow this natural progression to happen.
Yes, absolutely. If they know science and know it's been mapped out by science, they have a perspective on what's going on with them. We also find I have several new courses I brought out in the last while. So I've been very focused for 20 years in research on trauma and healing trauma. But my last 5 years has been spent researching elevated states. We have some new courses coming out now. And we're showing both remarkable brain change and remarkable behavioral change. But for the advanced ones, like people want to take a course and really get into the work, say, of Ramana Maharshi and Paul Brunton, we give them a mentor because they're going to start to experience things. As the ego starts to dissolve, they're going to be in some pretty weird places. They're kind of like drug trips. You're just meditating, but suddenly, for example, we had one guy in a workshop last year at Omega Institute, and he was in his early 40s. In his early 20s, he was a meditator, and he was really moving into these states and began to move into what Paul Brunton calls the void or the great silence. David Carson, another mystic, calls it perfect, brilliant stillness. And you hit that place of awareness, drifting in perfect, brilliant stillness. And, for me going there every morning, it's just unfettered ecstasy. But to this man at 23, it was terrifying. There's nothing there. There's no shred of ego to hang on to. Right. So it's really terrifying. And he got so frightened, he quit doing it the rest of his life. He never did again until that day at Omega. 20 years later, we're telling him, so what we're doing with people was we're giving them a mentor. We're giving them the actual one-on-one sessions with a highly qualified, trained person. Because some of these states, you start to see your death that's one thing that's happened for people. They see their death. They're sitting with other people. They can read their thoughts. They notice things start to get really unusual around them. There are all these kind of psychic phenomena that start to occur around them, and these can be really puzzling. And so as the ego starts to crumble and you're left with nothing, none of your familiar landmarks, it can be very disorienting. So we find they need a mentor. And then also as they start to reintegrate this, they need a mentor as they reintegrate with everyday life and become functioning human beings again. So yeah, these states are available to people, and it really pays to have some kind of guidance when you're doing that.
Absolutely. And I think that point about the importance of integration is where a lot of meditation techniques, especially prior to this movement of embodied practice, a lot of meditation techniques kind of took people out there, but just kind of left them there, right? And so this time spent at the end of meditation to realize that this awareness is alive within the body, within the environment here, and to orient that greater awareness is right here, right now, in the body, in the feet, in the hands, in the felt sense. And so it's not something somewhere you go and then you come back and this is a completely different world, but that is integrated right here, so that this right here is an expression of that.
Yes, and this is very new, because if you looked at Ramana Maharshi, for example, I mean, he left home, he went and lived at the mountain of Arunachala, and he lived in a cave, and he never left. He just basically spent a lot of his time there. He spent a lot of his time in silence after his enlightenment experience at the age of 16. And so the look at St. Francis, St. Clare, they went out and just, basically many of the ancient mystics, they just went out there and never came back. And I got to tell you too, it is very tempting. You don't really want to come back and deal with that team member who's being difficult. You don't want to deal with the hackers trying to get into your computer we have programs on secure servers, and we have people trying to hack into them, and I have to deal with that, and I have to deal with just the stuff of everyday life. And when you've been there in perfect brilliant stillness, do you really want to come back and deal with the hackers who are trying to hack into your server and steal your credit card information from your clients? You really don't.
Right.
But that's what the world needs. We need people who will come back and will be effective at that local mind level. So the old model was, you were a desert father, you're a hermit, you go there into the mountaintop like a cave, and you just stay there having a grand old time the rest of your life. And then the model today is you bring it right back and you volunteer in the prison, you volunteer in the homeless shelter. I've been doing a project with veterans with PTSD for the last 15 years, and we've now treated over 22,000 veterans with PTSD. That work needs to be done, and done well. And it's not going to be done if I'm, out there. So we need people who integrate, who are then effective parents, who are effective community members. Maybe go protest when something is not working in your community or your country. And so we need activists. We need mystics and activists. And the days when we could, drift off there are over. We need to be here. The world, the planet Earth, the human race needs what we have to bring in the office, in the boardroom, in the schoolroom, in the prison, in the hospital. All of these places need these awakened beings to bring these practices into everyday reality.
Yes, absolutely. Just the way you described at the beginning, holding that conflict that you had with that person you were working with, just holding it in that sky of awareness, right? Just allowing it to be present within that wider, vast consciousness, and hold a positive intention within that space and notice what happens.
Yes.
Oh, beautiful, Dawson. Stephen, anything else you want to ask before we begin to wrap up?
Well, I was just going to say, Dawson, I'm incredibly excited about your new book, because it speaks to the power of intention. That if we don't bring our intention to the hardware, then simply we don't use it. We don't ever bring that energy or consciousness to what already exists. And I think the power of what you're presenting in the new book is worth 100 million sales.
As my old Yiddish grandma used to say, from your mouth to God's ear.
Exactly. Well, in that case,
bring it
this is
down.
about your God's ear. Yeah, exactly. It's love.
But you know,
So,
we're salespeople.
We're
We're here to be salespeople. We're here to sell this idea. We're here to, like, you know, I just spent on marketing and marketing copy for one of my projects. I spent $50,000 on that. Now, that's a lot of money to spend on marketing a course. But I want to have a fantastic marketing job. Part of my job is to market these courses effectively. So I want to be effective and bring these to people. That's not going to happen by, you know, being out there. You want to be in here and be really effective with what you're doing. I want to reach millions of people. It's not as though I have to somehow egotistically think I'm the great person who's going to bring that to them, but they'll hear it from me, and then maybe they'll try something. Maybe they'll go take a course with me. This is our planet, and the more we can accelerate that process of change, the better. I'm also going to argue in the new book that we have been changing fundamentally, biologically, in our bodies as a species, and I can trace this back about 500 years, and we're going to be accelerating radically, because as you fire those neural bundles, you are wiring them, and we're seeing brain change now, not in 10,000 hours. We're seeing brain change in 30 days. I mean, substantial anatomical change of the brain, and no species has been able to do this before. No species, I mean, your dog and your cat cannot go and spend 30 days doing something and change their brains, and you can. After 30 days, we're showing that there's functional connectivity shifts in your brain after you're doing eco meditation. And so we want to get people doing this and accelerate that progress. And the pattern I'm seeing in history is that for 500 years, it's just obvious we've been becoming more compassionate. Democracy really began to get going 500 years ago. And I mean, there were little bright lights in Athens and ancient Greece, and there are parts of the world where there were signs of it. But then we really began to move toward democracy about 500 years ago. We began to move to end slavery about 300 years ago. And there was almost no momentum behind ending slavery for 1,000,000 years, and suddenly we ended it within 100 years. We gave women the vote. We went from having women disempowered politically to women having the vote in about 30 years. Gay marriage, legalization of marijuana, and all these things that are happening now within about 10 years. And all of these involve some degree of me letting go of something that benefits me and being compassionate for the greater good. So I see that as a trend in human history, and an accelerating one where we're becoming steadily more compassionate. And that trend is accelerating. What we can do, the courses we do, the marketing we do, the books we write, we want them to have an impact and help people with this awakening process. So that's why I'm not passive about all this. I really want to see all of these things effective and implemented.
Beautiful.
Beautiful.
So in
So
terms,
needed.
yes, it's so needed. Kevin, I was just going to say, in terms of that marketing and active rather than passive, how can people find you, Dawson? So please share every way for those 100 million people.
Well, I have done such a good job of marketing so far that if you type in Dawson Church, you get 32,000 hits on Google. So, but the best way to just approach both the trauma healing and the transcendent states is I have a website which has this meditation track that we've shown in MRI research produces fundamental structural anatomical change in the brain in 30 days. It's just amazing when we got that study back. It was just stunning to see that non-meditators just doing these simple things their brains changed in very short order. And that track is at the website Dawson, just my name, DAWSON, Dawson Gift, GIFT.com. And you can also download the EFT mini manual there and learn about tapping and all of the trauma research I've done. And after you go to DawsonGift.com, you will find yourself moving into our website where there are certified practitioners. There are tons of free courses and resources there. There are live workshops where I teach live. We have certified trainers who teach live. We have a big YouTube channel. We have a community YouTube session every week. We have all kinds of things people can do, including 2 courses that are implementing the results of this research. One is called a 21-day walk with your higher power. It's only $200. We made it super cheap, and it has you just develop a relationship with something larger than yourself in 21 days. And we've shown now in our very first studies being published of that course that it produces substantial changes in transcendent states within the first 3 weeks. It also then, in 6 months, produces substantial, significant changes in productivity. Your productivity at home and work goes up on average 26% when you have that relationship with something larger than yourself. So through that, you can also find the higher power course. And then we have a big, long 9-month course based on Ramana Maharshi and Paul Brunton called The Short Path to Oneness. So all of those are available through that Dawson Gift portal. And just go there, play, see what speaks to you.
Great, great. I look forward to going there right away. So, Dawson, we want to thank you so much for your time, for your beautiful insight and your years of wisdom. And thank you for the work you're doing with bringing research to these practices that are so important to Stephen and I and to all our viewers and fellow practitioners. So thank you for being with us. Thank you all for watching and participating with us. And we'll see you next time on the Raising Our Vibration podcast. Bye for now.